talk on the Eucharist. Last time when we met, we talked about the Eucharist as a sacrament. And so I asked this question last time, and I'm going to ask it again because it'll help us kind of review where we were and where we're going. Why did our Lord institute the Eucharist? This is reason or reasons. Okay, so I guess that could be the vegan response. Thousands of lambs. Well, but it took like 70 years, right? It took a while. But yeah. Yeah, okay. So certainly it was kind to the little lambs. What else can we think? Can we go a little deeper? Can we plunge a little deeper? So spiritual food for the journey, which really is what though? What is the food? Remember we said it's the bread of angels last time. Why do we say the bread of angels? That's such a good way to put it, one up Moses. So remember that we talked about this at the beginning, always like everything Moses did was because Jesus was going to do it. Jesus didn't have to do anything, right? So everything that happens in history always comes back to the incarnation from one direction or the other, right? From the future to the past. All right, so the idea of the bread of angels, right, was this communion with God, right? So which is why one of the names for the Eucharist is communion, right? So this enduring presence of God, right? Why else?
Decided to allow us to participate in himself.
Okay, so it's adapted to us, to the way we, the manner in which we can receive him. So it's communion, and I'll give you a little hint, presence, right? So his enduring presence, remember I said that he left his presence so that he would always be with us from the incarnation on, right? And then the third is what we're going to talk about today, which is sacrifice. And it's actually, sacrifice tends to be the one that people forget about, right? Because in today's kind of culture, everyone's all concerned about their rights and human rights, and but not so much on the rights of God, right? So why do we need to offer a sacrifice to begin with? All right, that's what we're gonna cover first. All right, so there is a virtue. It's called the virtue of religion, which is a sub-virtue of the virtue of justice. And justice is rendering someone their due. Religion is rendering what's due to God, okay? So religion, religare, means to bind. And so St. Thomas says that religion is a moral virtue by which a person is disposed to render to God the worship and service he deserves. It is sometimes identified with the virtue of justice toward God, whose rights are rooted in his complete dominion over all creation. So what do we owe God? Worship, yeah, everything in essence, yes. But worship, okay. So what does worship look like, though? Yeah, sacrifice. So we got to tease this out a little bit, because like in our contemporary culture, I say sacrifice, and you think like the thousands of little lambs that are getting slaughtered. But you think like, okay, there's like these crude, bloodthirsty, ritual sacrifices going on from primitive times. And some of that is because like Christ was the definitive sacrifice, and the sacrifice of the Eucharist, which was the sacrifice from then on, was unbloody. And so we don't necessarily associate it with that. But nevertheless, we need to offer sacrifices to God, right? That's part of what we owe him. All right. Yes, Megan. Yeah, I mean, that would be.
You have to sacrifice yourself to bring him into you. So it's your death that you give in a way. Yourself.
Yes and no. So it is your death, but it's actually your death so that Christ can live in you, right? Yes. So it's, what were you going to say? Okay, go for it. Yeah, so sacrifice inherently involves the separation of body and blood, right? So in that respect, when someone says that a sacrifice is inherently bloody, that's what they mean, right? But there is, in the sacramental realm, which we're going to talk about, there is such thing as an unbloody sacrifice, right? But it still involves the separating of the body and the blood, right? Yes.
No, but aren't there, even in kind of the old law, was there sacrifices of grain offerings or
Yes.
offerings or
Yes.
whatever?
Yeah. So, and I think what, or at least I've read into your question that the sacrifice for sin was most of what you're talking about, but for sure. So let's talk about the sacrifice. All right. So St. Thomas says that sacrifices are part of the natural law. So what does that mean? That means that everyone owes sacrifice to God. All right. And what I want to move us away from a little bit is just like the the thought that me not eating, another handful of M&Ms is a sacrifice. We use that as the language like of sacrifice, but that's not at all what we're talking about here. Okay. And in fact, when we're talking about that, really, it's everything has to come through the sacrifice of Christ, right? Because that's the most pleasing sacrifice. All right. So St. Thomas says, at all times and among all nations, there's always been the offering of sacrifices, right? No matter where you go throughout history, there's always been the offering of sacrifices. Now that can get twisted up, but in some places it wasn't twisted up, right? So I mean, if you had it always would degrade out of this, but a natural religion, right, that worshiped God through human reason alone, and did it in a way that could still be pleasing to God, they would still sacrifice, okay, because it's part of the natural law. So everyone owes God a sacrifice. Why is that? Why do you owe God a sacrifice? Like, why can't you just go, point to the sky after, like, somebody just hit a home run and just be done? Why do you need to offer sacrifice? I don't know what direction I'm going either, but we'll see.
In the Old Testament, part of why like sacrifices, it was from things like grain or from food. It was to show that trust in God of saying like, I can go without some of this because I know you're going to provide.
Okay, keep going with that though. So that's definitely along along the right sort of train of thoughts.
Does it have to do with like giving back to God what He gave us?
Why? Why would we give it back to him? Is he like an Indian giver? Like what? Like what?
Acknowledging His bounty.
Yeah. So we give back as an acknowledgement of his bounty. So that would be one of the things, right? So Thanksgiving would be one of the reasons we offer it back, right? So you just named one of the 4 reasons why we offer sacrifice to God. All right. And I already gave you one when I said sin offering. What are the other 2 reasons? Anyone know? Did you say petition? Yeah, petition would be the other one. And then there's a 4th one, which is the primary one, really. Well, it's adoration, right? Because he's infinitely above us, right? Infinitely above us. And so we owe him adoration, right? And because we're subject to him, and we're subject to him because he is Lord of all, right?
Acknowledging like that He holds our life would be part of the adoration. Like He has
Yeah, I mean,
taken
so
our life and
I mean, you could thank him for that, but the acknowledgement that, I mean, essentially, adoration is the acknowledgement of God's glory, right? And goodness, God's glory is just goodness known and seen, right? So for some known and seen good thing, you praise God. Yes, Megan.
So is adoration like encompass the whole like acknowledgement side of that of like I acknowledge your existence, therefore like I'm going to like you should burn offerings. So like I acknowledge you, so therefore I'm going to like participate like in mass and in the sacrifice. I acknowledge you, so I'm going to go cut this lamb for it and burn out this like
It's an acknowledgement, yes, but the form of it would change depending on what you were offering.
yeah, okay. So that was like my other question. That was like what if like mass is that sacrifice and you go to that sacrifice
Yeah, we're totally gonna get to that. Yeah, and that's the direction we're going. I was kind of messing with Ryan a little bit. I do know where we're going. So, all right. So let's get a definition then. Define our terms. So what's a sacrifice? So St. Thomas says a sacrifice, properly speaking, requires that something be done to the thing which is offered to God. All right. For instance, animals are slain and burnt, bread is broken, eaten, blessed. The very word signifies this, and sacrifice is so called because a man does something sacred. On the other hand, an oblation is properly the offering of something to God, even if nothing be done thereto. All right, so again, using my kind of silly M&M example, right? That would be an oblation, not a sacrifice. Okay. On the other hand, an oblation is properly the offering of something to God, even if nothing be done thereto. Thus, we speak of offering money or bread at the altar, and yet nothing is done to them. Hence, every sacrifice and oblation, but not conversely. First fruits are oblations because they are offered to God according to Deuteronomy 26, but they are not a sacrifice because nothing sacred was done to them. All right, and so we're beginning to see, okay, sacrifice may have some. Who makes something sacred? God, right? And so we're starting to get a direction, like maybe sacrifices go up. Maybe that's why we burn them, and then God gives us something back. There's an ascending part and a descending part, right? And I didn't say this, but it sort of goes without saying that we need tangible, visible sacrifices, because sort of along the lines of what Keegan said earlier, right? And that's sort of hidden and kind of weaved throughout this everything we're talking about, right? Right. So somehow, well, let me finish the quote and then we'll talk about it. Tithes, however, are neither a sacrifice nor an oblation, properly speaking, because they're not offered immediately to God, but to the ministers of divine worship. Okay, so something happens to the thing that's sacrificed. Right, something happens to it. God does something to it and gives it back to us, right? And so we tend to think sacrifice destroys, but that's not what God does, right? Sacrifice certainly changes the thing, but doesn't wholly destroy it, okay? And so, okay, so let's go back to sort of Megan's question a little bit. So why, so sacrifice of the lambs, for example, right? So there's a burnt offering, blood is spilled out, and the people take the lamb and eat it, okay? Why a lamb? Okay, well, yeah, so Christ is the Lamb of God, so he made lambs so that he could do that. But why that, why the burnt part, why the eating part, and why is the blood poured out and the people can't? Why is the blood left or not? Why is the blood given to God? Yes, Meg.
I'm not quite sure about the blood. I know for the burnt is the idea is like the burning something, burnt things create smoke rises.
Mm-hmm.
So it's going up.
Yes. Yep.
Blood is typically like used for cleansing, and blood is like your life essence and your life force. So maybe that can have something to do about like God gets that life essence and that life force, and He feeds us and He enters within us. So like that sacrifice enters us. So
okay, so you've hit. Oh, I mean, you're almost right on top of it. So the blood belongs to God because He is the giver of life, right? And so the blood would be poured out because now it's symbolic, right, of the person offering their life to God, right? So that the substitution is made of this thing offering the life, and God takes the life, right, as if it's your own. But to drink the blood would be to unite yourself with that thing that you're offering. All right. So think about that for a second, right? So to drink the blood would say that the life of this victim, I want it truly to be my life instead of symbolically. Okay. Right. So you can see why the Jews weren't allowed to drink the blood, right? Two reasons, right? For what I just said, but also because Christ was going to give his blood, and actually you do unite and his blood flows through your veins. Right? And it's also why that they would only offer things that were life-giving, right? Flesh of the lamb, bread. What else do they offer? different grains, right? All those things. Yes, Megan.
What about, like, I know they did the scapegoat. Like, there was a scapegoat ritual that they would do where they would send one goat, or they send a goat off and then like have it basically killed in the forest. And then the other goat they would keep with them and then sacrifice. And the idea is that like that goat that they sent off, the scapegoat, had their sins and then they were free of their sins.
Yeah, so they didn't slaughter that it just went off into the wilderness and didn't come back.
Okay.
So that was the idea, their sin going and taken out to the desert, right? Which is, why Christ starts in the desert, right? He's the scapegoat coming in. So that's why the Jews then didn't drink the blood, and why they also didn't offer things like gold. Right? In fact, that's an abomination. Why? Because gold doesn't give life, right? And it doesn't sustain human life. Right? And so that's at the heart of sacrifice, right? The sacrifices that are pleasing to God always involve things that sustain human life. And again, we get the sort of parallel with the Eucharist, right? What does it do? It sustains supernatural life, right? Remember, we said that as one of the things when we talked about the parallels between like the natural sort of the way our natural life direction, our natural life goes, where we eat, and then our supernatural life. How do you sustain natural life? You eat. How do you sustain supernatural life? You eat the Eucharist, right? So that's the idea. Okay. All right. So we already talked about this. So the four ends of sacrifice are adoration, thanksgiving, petition, and reparation for sin. All right. And we're going to keep coming back to that, especially when we get to the Mass. All right. What I want to do is talk a little bit about the sacrifice for sin. And then, because that's the one that Christ mentions, right, at the Last Supper. Fulton Sheen says, it is not hard for anyone who ponders on sin and guilt to recognize that sin is in the blood. And because life is in the blood, the shedding of blood expresses appropriately the truth that human life is unworthy to stand before the face of God. The shedding of blood, therefore, represented the emptying of sin. Right? And that's why Christ is fully emptied out, right? So that we can, again, we can have his blood going through it, his pure blood going through our veins, right? So this total emptying out of pure blood. All right, so I already talked about a little bit about the directions, right, of the sacrifice, up and down. Like you offer a sacrifice, something actually goes up, and then you actually receive something back, right? And it tends to be, we grasp that, right? When we think sacrifice, we tend to grasp the idea that, okay, something goes up to God, but we sometimes forget that something returns. Until I talk about the Eucharist, then everyone thinks, oh, I'm getting this. Not I'm giving this, right? So this is just about, like, the rest of what we're going to talk about mostly is not getting more out of Mass, it's giving more into it, okay? And so to start, what's a priest? A priest is someone who offers sacrifice, right? But a priest is also the one who's the mediator, okay? So he stands between the people and God. And so a sacrifice or priesthood always implies a sacrifice, right? If you remove sacrifice, there's no need for priests, right? That's why we call Protestant ministers preachers instead of priests, right? Because they don't offer a sacrifice, all right? And if they do call themselves priests, it doesn't really make sense because you're not offering a sacrifice, right? At the heart of being a priest is a sacrifice, all right? So those two things are sort of intrinsically linked, okay? And then the priest stands between the people and God. So you could see how Christ in the incarnation is the perfect priest, right? He literally stands between God and man, right? Fully God, fully man. And so the ascending part is always to give gifts to God, sacrifices, everything, right? And then the descending part is what God then returns back to us. And so the book of Hebrews, which is really, if you want to sort of grasp, and we'll talk more about this when we talk about holy orders, the priesthood of Jesus Christ, and really, if you want to understand why the church is Catholic and should be Catholic, and why Jesus wanted priests, we'll read the book of Hebrews, right? And so essentially what book of Hebrews is talking about is the new priesthood that Christ instituted, and then his sacrifice, which is the Eucharist. Okay. It says, for every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. Okay, so there's a need, obviously, everyone gets this, even in the sort of the natural religions, for the priest to be consecrated in some way, right? Because what he's going to give to God is supposed to be sanctified and holy, right? And the priest doesn't just give to God, he receives from God and then gives it to the people, right? And so in a certain sense, who is he standing in for when he does that? Right? God, right? I mean, we don't even need to go to New Testament, right? So why then were all the priests in the Jewish religion men? For the same reason that all the priests in the Catholic Church are men, okay? Because they're standing in the place of God, all right? And so he's uniting himself with God. All right, does that make sense? All right, so yes, Megan.
Sorry, this is more of a question. I was having a conversation with someone, and so they asked me, does that insinuate that God has to be a man then? And so what implications does that give to the why actually does he have to be a man?
Yeah, so
Not, I trust you on that, but it's just more like.
yeah, so it has to do with just for the same reason we call God he and not she, right? So the sacramentality of masculinity, what it means, right? I mean, the short answer is, well, that's the way Jesus did it. But the longer answer as to why Jesus did it that way is because the masculine is always the giver of life, right? Always coming in from the outside. And so if you, that is nonsensical to our world today because they just think, yeah, well, it's not even that. They just view like it, we have different words for it now, right? Like sex and gender are two different things somehow, but they just view it as just some accident and not touching the core of the person. Yeah, so it's the masculine thing, right? Okay. All right. So all throughout the Old Testament, we find God is very meticulous about how sacrifice is supposed to be offered, and we sort of grasp why that would be because they're meant to prefigure the sacrifice of Christ, right? And so of course he's going to be very specific on that. But what we don't necessarily grasp is that there is a greatest sacrifice. All right. So let's talk about first of all sacrifice, and then why Christ's sacrifice is the greatest, and why the Eucharist is also the greatest sacrifice you can make. So St. Augustine says, now there are four things to be considered in every sacrifice: who it's being offered to, who it's being offered by, what it is that's offered, and who it is offered for. And this one true mediator, he's talking about Christ, and reconciling us to God by his sacrifice of peace, would remain one with him to whom he offered it, and make one in himself those for whom he offered it, and be himself who offered it one at the same time it was offered. All right. So the value of the sacrifice of Calvary comes from what? Well, so of those four things, right? Like who it's offered to, it's the victim, right? Like, because the victim is a pure victim, right? And the priest has a pure heart, right? And in fact, the priest has such a pure heart that he's united almost perfectly to God. Not almost perfectly to God. And so the dignity of the victim starts, like what you offer to God is the biggest part, right? Like the biggest, most important thing, right? So if, like, just think about, I run over someone's dog, right? And I hand them an apple back, right? As my sacrifice, right? That doesn't really cover it, right? What if I run over their dog and I hand them, a big gold block, right? Well, that's more than enough, right? So there has to be some sort of proportionality for it to be pleasing. Yes, Connor.
So, first about the sacrifice or offer the actual act of offering the sacrifice. I think I remember hearing someone at one point draw a distinction between. So in the Old Testament, you would offer sacrifice, especially like you say a animal sacrifice, the offering would involve not actually be like the killing I think when someone's talking about Christ's sacrifice, they seem to make a distinction between, like Christ wasn't killing himself, I guess, to say, like, as a sacrifice. He was, or was he, like, or is there something else in the term of the offering that is not just actual death?
No, I mean, so it's not, no, he's not killing himself, right? So it's, he's offering himself. That's the difference, right? So he's offering himself, but somebody else does the slaying, right? Yeah. All right. So the dignity of the victim is the first thing, right? So what you offer is the most important thing. Yes, Lizzie.
Can you distinguish who it is offered to and who it is offered for?
Yes. So who it is offered to is God the Father, right? In a certain sense, the entire all three persons of the Trinity, right? But it's offered for who? What are the words of consecration? Think about it. For the many, right?
Yeah.
Right. So
Okay, that's what I was thinking. I just wanted to.
yeah, that's why the words of consecration are so important, right? Like, because it's literally like it's saying, here's what I'm doing, and here's the offering I'm making for, here's why I'm offering it, and here's who I'm offering it for. Right. So he does all of those things all in that one, right? Yes.
This is like another phrase for offered for, like, on behalf of.
Yeah, I mean, so it doesn't, it's not necessarily like on someone's behalf, it's just for them, right? So it isn't, because I can never make that sacrifice that Christ made, right? That's the problem, right? It's like an infinite debt that only God can pay himself, right? And so he's not sort of doing it for me. I mean, in my place, but it's pure gift. Like he's, and we've used the example before of like, he's giving me this like divine like currency now that I couldn't get a handle on, but he gives it to me now, and I can now pay my debts. All right, does that make sense? So what happened on Calvary? Its value first and foremost comes from the victim. Second comes from the priest who offered it. Third, from the heart or the interior of the person offering it. And then fourth, because of the unity between the priest and the victim, right? So the thing is infinitely valuable to the priest. Okay. All right. So this we'll come back to this, but I want, so this is one of the things that people often will say. They're like, well, sacrifices ended with the Old Testament, and plus when we start Lent, we hear, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Why does God desire mercy and not sacrifice? What does that mean? Because you could easily, if you read this out of context, right, you could easily turn around and go, well, see, we don't need to do sacrifices. Well, I would say that one sacrifice is extremely merciful, right? Yeah.
One, isn't that just to know, like, he's asking for, like, the sacrifice that we do at Mass, not just for any, like,
Yes.
he doesn't want a sheep, he wants that.
Yeah, and it's to remember though that the reason why, like in that, I think it's from the book of Joel, in that passage, God's kind of berating them for just going through the motions, right? And because their heart's not in it, right? But was Christ's heart in it? Yeah, right. Like so much so that it was pierced. And so that's why it's that perfect sacrifice. He's going to give that sacrifice to us, right? Because it's not just his sacrifice, it's the church's sacrifice, right? Because we still have to offer sacrifices, right? That's what we started from the beginning. That's what we're talking about. Yes, sir. Yeah, we're going to talk about that at the end, but yes. And if I didn't answer your question, then ask me again. So this is the part that what I really want us to sort of now begin to focus on is how we better give at Mass. Okay. I think we did last week or last time, we talked more about receiving, but I want to talk a lot about giving, like what we're supposed to give. All right. All right. So the first, to start that, we have to see what's going on as Christ's sacrifice given to the church. All right. So it's not just about the church benefiting from Christ's sacrifice, but it's also the church being empowered to continually make that same sacrifice. All right. So, so in a certain sense, Christ sought to leave the church a means by which it could still offer a perfect sacrifice, right? And so now, when you offer the Mass, you're offering to God a perfect sacrifice, right? This is why the Mass is the most important thing you will do any day that you go. Not even close, right? Not even close. Okay, and that is really important for us to grasp, because you can be as busy as all get out doing all these things for God, but the most pleasing thing to him is the Mass. Okay. All right. And I mean, that's kind of, when we can go to daily Mass, that's probably what we should do. Nothing is more pleasing. Okay. All right. We'll just keep going a little deeper. All right. So here's what I want to do. What I want to do first is kind of juxtapose the Calvary with what happened in the upper room. All right. And because just as Catholics, we need to sort of understand the connection between the two, be able to defend them a little bit, but to then understand that they're in a certain respect, they're distinct events, right? Even though they're linked. All right. So first question, and I think we've gone over this before, and if we have, we can go pretty quickly. So Jesus is crucified. All right. How does anyone know that's a sacrifice? So when the Romans or the Jews looked on him on the cross, how did they know it was a sacrifice? They didn't, right? The answer is they didn't. How would they know? Like, it's just a criminal being hung on a tree, right? And in fact, we wouldn't know either, nor would the apostles, or I guess the apostles wouldn't know, nor would we, if it wasn't for what he said, right? And what did he say the night before? Yeah, he told the apostles, he pointed to, he said, this is what all of this that's about to happen actually means. All right. I mean, those are all like motives of credibility, but in the end, someone could just go, well, that's ironic. Well, yeah, I don't think there's any. Yeah, I don't think there's any. Like, I don't think that part is miraculous in any way. But the symbolic nature of it is, right? Yep. Yeah, I mean, yeah, like I think we may have talked about it last time about how John says, well, like, okay, I swear, like he's sitting here, I was like, I swear that happened, the blood and water coming out. The other stuff, isn't near as important as this thing, because he's like, I witnessed that thing.
That goes like back to also to like the tie to Moses, because Moses gave them bread in the desert.
Mhm.
The manna with their life.
Yes, it all ties back, right? So he's the new temple, and then there's blood and water flowing out from the temple, right? Brendan, were you going to say something? Oh, that night they knew exactly. Like, yeah. I mean, they're. I mean, and if you sort of understand what's going on, and like the feet washing is like a ritual, like ordination, right? And so they're like, well, wait a second. And you can even, I think maybe Brant Petrie, one of them, does something about Jesus at Caesarea Philippi is actually ordaining or telling Peter that he's going to be the new high priest, because he goes to this place where they, the pagans had their high priests, and so anyway, yeah. So they had a full understanding what he was doing, and what that made them do, right? Because what does he say? Like, he washes their feet and he says, now you have to do this, and that's not to take the second interpretation away from it. It's both. But first and foremost, that cleaning is a ritual cleaning that, if you go back to the book of Leviticus, and you look and see what happened to, or even Exodus, and you look and see what happened to Aaron and his sons, their feet are washed, right? And the rest of them are clean. And so when they become priests, they're like, okay, what are we offering? And he tells them. So yeah, I mean, again, not grasping the full import of it, but they do know, okay, this is we're priests now, and this is the sacrifice we're offering. All right, so this actually is a really good question to ask Protestants, right? When you're talking to them, to ask them, okay, well, you say Christ sacrificed on the cross. How do you know that was a sacrifice? And it becomes unintelligible if Christ doesn't call a shot, right? Very specifically, not like I'm going to die, like some other time. He says very specifically, right? And so what happens in the upper room is him instituting the Eucharist, right? And so that's a different event, because that is in and of itself complete and total, right? Because what could the apostles have done the next day? Celebrated Mass, right? They could have celebrated Mass even if he wasn't dead, even if he was on the cross, even if he was in a prison somewhere, right? They could have still celebrated Mass. Now the whole concomitants, like we're going to talk about in a minute, would be different. But nevertheless, they were giving a complete and total event sacrifice, right? Okay, because he told them, this is the new covenant in my blood. All right, so a covenant is made right there. Okay. All right, so here's what Pope Benedict says about interpreting the crucifixion. The interpretation of Christ's death on the cross in terms of the cult represents the inner presupposition of all Eucharistic theology. Trust me, that's what I just said, right? He's using big Pope Benedict words. An event that was in itself profane, the execution of a man by the most cruel and horrible method available, is described as a cosmic liturgy, a tearing open the closed up heavens, as the act by which everything that hitherto been ultimately intended, which had been sought in vain by all forms of worship, now in the end actually comes about. All right. All right, and this is just kind of an authoritative statement saying exactly what I just said. That he might leave to his own beloved spouse the church a visible sacrifice, such as the nature of man requires. All right, so everything we just said. Whereby that bloody sacrifice, once to be accomplished on the cross, might be represented, and the memory thereof remain even unto the end of the world, and its salutary virtue be applied to the remission of those sins which we daily commit. Declaring himself constituted a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek, he offered to God the Father his own body and blood under the species of bread and wine, and under the symbols of those same things. So again, there's that divide between the Last Supper. And again, even though the Last Supper finds its meaning or finds its fruit from the crucifixion finds its meaning in the Last Supper. Okay. Yes.
So, my shoulder wants to go out. So, what's the importance of mentioning Melchizedek?
Okay, so Melchizedek is an Old Testament priest that Abraham encounters. I don't know, maybe chapter 16 or 17, and he offers bread and wine. That's his sacrifice, right? And then Psalm 110 talks about David and David's son, and then talks about there being a priest forever in the line of Melchizedek. And then the book of Hebrews closes the loop and says Christ is.
So that's why you bring up Melchizedek. Because I was always confused about why we drop Melchizedek and that not being what we would do, but just more be like significance of him.
Yeah. So he is, so in the book of Hebrews, it actually talks about why there's a parallel between him and Christ. It says that we don't know anything about Melchizedek. He was out without father, right? So without human father, just like Christ. So he's a type of Christ. And then Christ offers his sacrifice, right? Bread and wine.
I hate using this term, but I don't know what it's using from the later. He's supposed to be like a Christ-like figure from the Old Testament.
Yeah, definitely. We just call it a type, right? A type would just be pointing from the Old Testament forward to Christ. So yes. Yes.
When you say Melchizedek doesn't have to be father, you mean because
Yeah, we don't know who he is. I mean, we don't know who he is. That's what that's what Hebrews says. So we don't know where he came from, as if he's without father. Let me think about if there's something else I want to say about that. Okay. All right. So that order is important, right? So first the institution, then the sacrifice, then the commemoration. Okay. All right. So now let's pick apart. Again, this is more sort of for apologetics reasons, for us to sort of just understand the distinction and sort of the difference between the two sacrifices. In the two sacrifices, talking about Calvary and the sacrifice of Mass, there's one and the same victim, one and the same priest. All right. So why is it the same sacrifice? Same victim, same priest, right? Okay. Who then on the cross offered himself, and who now by instrumentality of his priests offers himself anew, the two sacrifices differing only in their mode. All right. So one is offered, we'll say naturally, and then one is offered sacramentally, right? So what does a sacrament, remember I think I talked about this at the very beginning of the semester. We talked about how we talk about there being this sort of supernatural realm and then the natural realm. And I told you there's really a third one, and it's sacramental, right? Where things behave a certain way, right? And so what does a sacrifice look like in the sacramental realm? Right. It's important to grasp this only because someone would say, okay, well, I don't see any sacrifice happening. And you would say, well, actually it is. That's what a sacrifice in the sacramental realm looks like. The body and the blood are separated on the altar, right? That's why they're consecrated separately. And so that's why it's a sacrifice. Yes.
Where does it fit in the different churches? I don't know if it's just Protestant or like more of the Eastern rite that will have the bread and the wine.
Well, so they won't consecrate them at the same time, right? So the consecration part is important because it's actually separating what really at this point can't be separated, right? Like in his natural body, those things can never be separated again. But in the sacramental realm, they can be, and they are. And so the bringing back together is, and even in the Roman rite, the priest will drop a small piece of the host in there to show that the body and blood really aren't separated, right? They are one thing. Like his body and blood are together once he rose from the dead. Yes. Well, yeah, I mean, I think I would go all those directions all at once because you want to draw them. What I mean, almost always do is try to draw someone into the book of Hebrews and then they're gone, right? Because the question always would be, okay, well, it says Christ is a priest forever. Priests offer sacrifices. What is his sacrifice? And you could say Calvary, and you will say, okay, that was once. Like, how is he offering it forever? Right. And then the question, and you go, well, here it's exactly how he's offering it, right? And then you just take them through chapter 7, 8, 9, and 10 of the book of Hebrews. Mm-hmm. Why we don't need a multiplicity of them, exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about that because that's one of the ways you put more into the Mass. Yeah, it's probably
serious.
Oh, I'm sure. I don't doubt it. It's just I'm surprised they were even interested.
Well, she might actually know. She's met Connor. She's went to mass before. She's interested in it. She just doesn't understand like why we only have one form of sacrifice whenever they have multiple. Does that make sense? Like,
Yeah.
that whole concept of it.
Well, now you can tell them, right? Because it is all four types of sacrifices. Okay. All right, we already talked about this. About concomitance, where essentially this is just that when you receive one communion under one kind, you receive the entire Christ. Okay, we've already talked about that. I think we already talked a little bit about this too, but let's. This will help draw us back to where I want to go. So Cain and Abel, right? Cain offers a sacrifice, and Abel offers a sacrifice, and God rejects one and keeps the other. Why? Why does he do that? Yes, Connor. You have a question?
I didn't think about
Okay, go ask the question and we'll go back to
it.
this.
So kind of going back where we're talking about the second hour, is each mass a new sacrifice, or is it just like the same one sacrifice, or is it kind of?
Yeah, you wouldn't say it's a new sacrifice. You would say it's the one sacrifice we presented. Yes.
Abel brought the fatty portion of the first thing, like he brought the really good part of his first fruits versus Cain just says he brought an offering. God appreciated.
But where is Cain's heart? Because what's the words that God doesn't really say, bring something better to me. He says, right? If you act rightly, you will be accepted, right? So it has nothing to do with, per se, the thing being offered. It's starting out with Cain's disposition, right? No, see, here's the beauty of it, right? This is where I was going with this, right? Is that whose heart is offering the mass, right? So now we actually have access to something, the perfect sacrifice every single time, right? That's the key to all of this, right? And so that what flows out of my hands and flows back into my heart certainly depends on my disposition, but it's no less pleasing to God, right? Because it's Christ who offers it. It's Christ who's the victim. It's Christ who's, whose heart is revealed. All of those things, okay? And then we just have to conform ourselves to Christ. Just.
So, if the priest's heart is not in it, we know Christ's heart's in it. We should, if we're in a state of grace, we should receive. If the words of consecration are messed up, then don't.
Yeah. So that's more like a canon law typey question. I mean, unless they were like totally butchered, like, he picks up the bread and says, this is, the wonder of wonder, like totally butchers it, then, I wouldn't get caught into that. Like, I would not get caught up in that trap. Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't get, but I've been in masses where priests haven't been very attentive and they've said the consecration over the wine twice or over the bread twice. Like, not good, but doesn't make it invalid.
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to distinguish when there's times where it would not be appropriate to receive, even though you're in a state of grace.
Are there times? I mean, yeah. Well, the peanut gallery in the back wants me to put my foot down. So theoretically, I would say that I wouldn't receive any time that there's desecration going on in the manner in which it's being distributed. That would be my. Well, you got to decide what you think the I'm not.
So it's like a simple act.
Yeah. So I've asked this question before. I'll ask it again. What is the worst sin that we currently, as a people, are doing? Yeah, like, because it's offense directly at God, right? And like, I totally don't want to get in the whole like receiving on the tongue versus receiving in the hand, but in my what I don't understand is if you really believe it's Christ, why you would even risk touching it and having a particle fall on the floor. That's unfathomable to me. Like, why, if you really believe that? Now, I understand like bad catechesis and, but there's no reason for people who know what that really is to receive it in anything out of the hand of a priest on your tongue. So and I feel comfortable saying, like, I don't, like, you can receive it in the hand. Doesn't mean you should, right? Like somebody is going to have to step up, because the Eucharist, like somebody is going to have to receive Jesus beautifully and with a pure heart, and it might as well be us, right? That's my sort of opinion, right? Yeah, so it never was actually like that. So so there is, I think it's Cyril of Jerusalem has in his I think it's in his Mystagogy, he talks about having received, like he says, make a throne with your hand or whatever. And them receiving in the hand when they did that was way different than we do it, right? So they may or may not have been wearing gloves, but they would literally just go like this, fingers, like it's not ordinary food. So think about what we're doing when we, who gives us himself? Jesus, right? If I take Jesus with my hand, who gave me Jesus? Me, right? Yeah. So like our actions show what we believe in. Like, so I am feeding myself. It's just ordinary food then. So like the whole communion in the hand thing has destroyed faith in the Eucharist, right? Because I'm watching and I'm going, oh, okay, this is just like regular food. And what do now most people believe? Regular food, right?
The way Casey described it to me was like back in persecution, they only allowed receiving on the hand because there was fear someone would like come in and intercept when they were receiving on the tongue. And it was done like kneeling and you would go completely down.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, there's definitely, there is definitely proof that at some point people were doing that. It would never really spread from the whole church, but once, see, here's the thing, right? So people will,
Because I know in other countries, like you're not allowed to receive on the hand at all. Because when I went to visit in Poland, I got like we I remember this very concretely because like we were like basically told like we'd all receive on the hand because that's what we're all taught to do. When we got there, they're like, be careful receiving on the hand because the older women will start yelling at you in Polish.
good.
And like
Yeah,
not
good.
like nice yelling.
Yeah, I don't know why, like,
So like because like I know I googled it, so I didn't understand like why there was some of this
Right.
created.
Yeah, I don't know why, like Indiana, like why they keep it this. I mean, I can tell you why it was allowed initially. It was supposed to be an exception.
Yes,
That-
that's what, yeah, I was gonna say
yeah.
the exception.
Yeah, but for us in like the modern world, exceptions always become rules. Like you can't make exceptions because they always become rules. And so, specific people should have asked if they needed it for whatever. I don't know why you would need it, but they should have asked if they needed it, and then the Holy See could have granted them permission, but that isn't the way it was done. Yes.
Became a thing here was way back when it was a couple decades or centuries ago.
1965 is when it was.
Other countries, yeah. Okay, I said decades first.
Yeah.
But other countries were receiving on the hand, and so it went to the papacy, and they were like, "So what's the deal?" And the papacy basically was like, "Okay, there are enough people doing it, like we'll grant it." And then no one was doing it in the U.S. actually, and then the bishops in the U.S. were like, "Hey, can we start doing that?" And the papacy was like, "I mean, like, I guess if you need to." And then they were like, "Sweet," and then that's why we all grew up being told to receive on the hand.
I thought it was to make Protestants look uncomfortable.
No.
It was like a really dumb thing.
Consider the rest of Protestants.
Yeah. So anyway, to close the loop on the historical, at least part of it. So by the 6th century, the church actually got rid of it. Like there's magisterial documents from the 6th century saying that it's not listed to receive in any way but on the tongue. And so for till 1965, that was the norm.
Isn't there a lot you said also like the priest washes their hands and consecrates their hands before every mass?
Yeah, that's a lot. Well, the priest's hands are consecrated when they're ordained too, right? And and like the fathers of the church, for example, like Mary Magdalene, right? What does Jesus say to her when he touches her? When she touches him. Well, don't touch me, right? What does he say to Thomas? Why can Thomas touch him? And I mean, that the Father's Church understood that as priesthood, right? Thomas's hands were consecrated, so therefore he could touch the body of Christ. But again, that's not a popular interpretation today, but that's exactly what's going on, right? Good, man. I'm so happy you're here. Yeah, so I have an opinion on that maybe I don't know, maybe you're not gonna like. So I think it's abused because especially now, like it's not needed. The churches are half full. Like, and again, it was meant to be an exception for things like a priest that's too infirm to come off the altar, a priest that's sick that doesn't want to distribute communion to other people. It was, I mean, literally that it's extraordinary for a reason, right? Like it's now ordinary. Like there's no, like I can't remember last time I was at a mass, maybe even at like a daily mass that wasn't a private mass that didn't have a Eucharistic minister. Like that's so unnecessary, right? I just think that it just leads to like the more people that touch the body of Christ, like the more likely it is that it's going to end up somewhere, right? And not to mention, like most of the time, Eucharistic ministers, especially now, like when they're done, they just go hand gel, right? Like, well, what happened to the particles that were on your fingers, right? Yeah, I mean, yeah. Yeah, but I promise you are rare in that, right? So. Yeah, and so I would never tell anyone not to do it. I would just say that I think it's an abuse, and it only gets worse as time goes on. No, we definitely don't need more.
And like that would be like the only thing that you would definitely need to say is like, do we need an extra first mass? And like the answer is no.
Yeah, it's funny. Like in our parish, I will never go to the Eucharist minister, but sometimes I'll come over to the line, right? And so like I'll just like walk by them, and my wife was like, she's like, I kind of feel bad for them standing there. I was like, look, you should walk by sticking your tongue out at them and making them feel really bad so they don't want to do it anymore. Like supply and demand, right? Like totally like, and I mean, I'm kidding, but I'm not, right? It's it has led to a whole like set of problems, right? That, the more people that touch the Eucharist, the more things that can go wrong, right? All right. I'm going to blame Aaron and Connor for taking me down that.
If I can get it back on track, what was all that 10 seconds?
Oh, his heart. All right. So now totally off. All right. So how many of you have ever read this verse from Romans? I urge you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God, your spiritual worship. Do not conform yourselves to this age, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that you may discern what is the will of God and what is good and pleasing and perfect. Yeah, what is? No. So this is Eucharistic, right? Living sacrifice ought to be like a big, like flashing light, right? Because when you unite yourself with Christ, you unite yourself to the living sacrifice in the Mass, and it's holy and pleasing to God, your spiritual worship. Okay. So this is, first and foremost, is Eucharistic. All right. And so let's now talk about that. So remember way back when we talked about baptism, I said that we look at the characters we receive in baptism, confirmation, holy orders as badges, right? That deputize us and make us, give us certain powers to do things, right? And I said that when you're baptized, you're deputized to you become a priest, right? To make spiritual sacrifices. And so this is what St. Thomas is talking about. He says, in a sacramental character, Christ's faithful have a share in his priesthood. in the sense that as Christ has the full power of spiritual priesthood, so his faithful are likened to him by sharing a certain spiritual power with regard to the sacraments and to things pertaining to the divine worship. All right. And so what is St. Thomas talking about? He's talking about how we can offer the Eucharist. So there has been since Second Vatican Council, and this sort of fits in with at least the Eucharistic minister thing, this push within the liturgy for what people call active participation. All right. How many of you have ever heard this term? Like, okay. How many of you actually know what it means? Yeah, like a lot of people actually don't know what it means. Like active participation in the Mass. Like you hear active participation. Well, most people in church hear active participation. They're like, okay, well, we're going to need 17 more Eucharistic ministers. We're going to need 13 greeters. We're going to need somebody to, I don't know, offer hand gel, like all these things, right? They're like, how can we get more people involved in the Mass? Yeah. Anyway, so, but that's not what that means. All right. Well, no, it means actually doing what's like paying attention to what's going on and doing it with the priest. All right. Yeah. Yeah. So I got another slide and this will help us to sort of get more. All right. So the priest, again, there's a fundamental difference in what the priest does between ours, right? So he says, pray, brethren, that this, my sacrifice and yours, right? So there's a fundamental difference between how he participates in the Mass and what he offers versus how we participate and how we offer, okay? And so that's what I want to sort of unpack. This sacrifice is so decisive for the salvation of the human race that Jesus Christ offered it and returned it to the Father only after he left us a means of sharing in it as if we had been present there. Each member of the faithful can thus take part in it and it inexhaustibly gain its fruits. So each member of the faithful can thus take part in it and inexhaustibly gain its fruits. Yes.
I guess it's more of a personal question, but is it perfectly fine to like go to the notes order and say just all the prayers, say the Our Father and all that in my head, versus like going to a Latin Mass where I know it's gonna be like I'm praying it to myself silently. So like.
So you mean like not audibly responding?
Yeah, like I find myself.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything in the rubrics that says you have to respond audibly. I don't think.
I've like been told before that like if it's like also too sometimes people will take pride and be like, oh, I'm gonna be louder or whatever, and like they can turn into a sin by like praying out loud like that for them. So I have like a friend who they don't pray out loud at Mass because of that, because they don't recommend them have to. So they don't turn into like that way they can be humble doing it, but they have to pray it like quietly or like within their own mind. Yeah,
I think the only danger to not doing it is that people around you may go, oh, I don't really feel like praying either, right? Because they can't tell. So that might be you can do it silently and moving your lips, right, to stay interior, but I think that's the only danger to doing it that way. But certainly if you're up in the front at daily Mass, probably not an issue, but I could certainly see that, someone. Yeah, so now we're going to talk about what active. It might be this. Hold on, let me see. All right, so one, yes, Keegan.
I would think that the bodily movement and actually using your voice was part of the participation.
The bodily movement for sure. Like, so you can't like do your own thing. I don't know that, like strictly speaking, whether you have to be audible or not, but yeah. But I don't see why you wouldn't. Like, but I understand what you're saying too. Like you're supposed to be praying the Mass, and if that keeps you praying the Mass, good. Yeah. Yeah, and unfortunately, no sort of Mass is not quiet. Like that's just the reality of it, and it moves pretty quickly. All right, so a couple more steps, and then we're going to talk about concretely how we do some of this stuff. All right, so Pope Pius XII in his Mediator Dei says all the faithful should be aware that to participate in the Eucharistic sacrifice is their chief duty and supreme dignity. So your chief duty is to participate in the Eucharistic sacrifice. and that not in an inert and negligent fashion, giving way to distractions and daydreaming, but with such earnestness and concentration that they may be united as closely as possible with the high priest, according to the apostle. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. All right, so he's talking about participating, again, fundamentally different way, but participating in in the priesthood of Christ, right? But now he's going to also talk about us participating in the victimhood of Christ, right? Which is a really important part. It is quite true that Christ is a priest, but he is not a priest just for himself, but for us. When in the name of the whole human race, he offers our prayers and releases homage to the eternal Father. He is also a victim, and for us, since he substitutes himself for sinful man. Now, the exhortation of the apostle, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, requires that all Christians should possess, as far as is humanly possible, the same dispositions as those which the divine Redeemer had when he offered himself in sacrifice. So stirring that up, making yourself a victim, right? Which is why the gifts are brought forward by the symbolic sort of nature of the gift, of bringing the gifts meant to being brought forward, right? Because those are supposed to come from the people, right? He offered himself in the same, that is to say, they should, in a humble attitude of mind, pay adoration, honor, praise, and thanksgiving to the supreme majesty of God. Moreover, it means that they must assume to some extent the character of a victim, that they deny themselves as the gospel commands, that freely and of their own accord they do penance, and that each detests and satisfies for his sins. All right, we're going to talk about how to do this in just a second. All right, so just concrete things. So each Mass has three fruits. There's the general fruit. So the Mass is said for the whole church. All right, and then there's the special fruit, which is applied to the benefit for those whom the Mass is offered for. So this Mass is offered for. And then we can also have personal fruit. So we can offer the Mass for someone. Okay, and I think I talked about this last time, how an unbelievably large amount of time I take a need to Mass, I offer Mass for it, God responds. It happens quite frequently, right? So be very intentional about it, right? When you and again, like this goes back to just being intentional about, you go to Mass saying, I offer this in adoration, and then tell God you adore him, tell him why you adore him. I offer this in thanksgiving. Tell God why, what you're thanking him for very specifically. I offer this in reparation for my sin. Confess your sins to God. I offer this for XYZ. Okay. Don't miss that opportunity, right? And I think I told you before, on the way to communion, very often what I'll do is I'm having a real encounter with Christ. I just go to him and tell him what he needs to heal in me. And again, very often he responds really quickly. Okay. Yes, Keegan.
So I've heard this in regard to the Eucharist, where you would say, like, we are offering the entirety of the Mass.
Yeah, so you can offer the Mass for whatever you want.
So, like, I guess the way I've heard that phrase, like, oh, you offer the Eucharist after you receive it for someone, but it would be.
Yeah, you don't need to do it like when you receive. It's at like the sacrifice. Remember, so the sacrifice is complete on the altar, right? And so the offering has been made. You're receiving it as, I don't want to say independent of it because it's not, but that's not the sacrificial part of it, right? Like that. Remember, the Eucharist has those three aspects of it. And that's communion for you, right?
So our offering the Mass is more so in the Eucharistic prayer itself, kind of that sacrifice.
Yeah, like very specifically, yes. Yeah. And it's in a lot of ways that idea has been lost because the Mass has a little bit been stripped of like sacrificial language, right? And so people don't realize, like, oh, when I go to Mass and I can't receive communion, but I can still offer it for somebody, like and it's efficacious. Like that's a big deal. That's non-trivial, right? And whereas people think, it's like the drive-through lane or something, like I've got to go get something for it to have been worthwhile, right? And that's the giving of it. Johnny, you had a question?
Yeah, so the second one, the Fructus Socialis, how do you say that? Is that's what the priest is. Like that's determined by the priest who's offering mass. Who the mass is offered for, and what do you think about being offered mass?
Yes. Yeah, I think at the bottom, it's a little misleading by what I put at the bottom there. Yes.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Concelebrating mass. Does one concelebrating mass equal? There are two priests concelebrating mass. Is equal to they said mass individually, or is it just one mass?
I don't know. I have no idea. I have no idea how, but I would guess that a priest, like say a priest, I don't know if there's actually priests that do this. So they have to say mass every day. So if their one mass is concelebrated, I would imagine that applies. So maybe yeah. All right. So this sort of answers your question, Keegan, about whoever receives the sacrament expresses thereby that he's made one with Christ and incorporated in his members, and this is done by living faith. There's no one who is in mortal sin, and therefore it manifests that whoever receives this sacrament while in mortal sin is guilty of lying to the sacrament. Notice how he says it in the sense of like you only lie to a person, right? And consequently of sacrilege because he profanes the sacrament and therefore he sins mortally. Right. So this is about receiving worthily. And then finally, this is from Pope Pius X, which if you have Latin Mass, Roman Missal, this prayer is actually in there. It says, "Don't pray Holy Mass, but pray the Holy Mass." Right. So don't like that was an abuse of the Mass. That was an abuse of the Latin Mass where people praying the rosaries, praying other things, not praying the Mass. Right. The Holy Mass is a prayer itself. He calls it the highest prayer that exists. It is the sacrifice dedicated by our Redeemer at the cross and repeated every day on the altar. If you wish to hear Mass as it should be heard, you must follow with eye, heart, and mouth all that happens at the altar. Further, you must pray with the priest the holy words said by him in the name of Christ and which Christ says by him. You have to associate your heart with the holy feelings which are contained in these words, and in this manner you ought to follow all that happens at the altar. When acting in this way, you have prayed Holy Mass. The holy sacrifice of Mass may be offered to God with a fourfold intention: adoration, thanksgiving, petition, and atonement. Right? And so following along and praying with the priest, you actually are praying the Mass. Okay. Yes, Ryan.
How does doing mass life work? Is it
It's the same thing. I mean, it doesn't. I mean, there's the limit is because of the danger of it becoming routine, right?
so let's what I'm talking about. Like let's say you go to one mass, right?
Mhm.
You offer up the sacrifice for one person, and you go to a second mass, and you offer up like can you like are they two separate entities?
Oh yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so it's not like it doesn't carry.
No, you don't get like one a day or No, you get
like a one sacrifice.
yeah.
And
No,
you don't get, like,
each
separate.
Mass is like an independent entity in that way.
Can you dedicate when you dedicate a mass? Can you not dedicate multiple? So like this is associated, but like like can you not like offer up for in like the multiple type of ways? So like you have like the sacrifice and some multiple sacrifice. Can you not do like the Thanksgiving for someone else?
Well, yeah.
That's what I was about to do. Is like you should have a person that you're offering a mass for. You should be thanking God for something in your life, asking for blessings on it, and then it's.
Yeah, I mean, it's not. I mean,
powerful kind of
I would feel totally comfortable testing God's generosity, like just to ask. Like I wouldn't worry about going. Yeah, just wait. I can only have one. Like it's not a genie, right? Like it's not telling you like rub the ciborium and I'll give you. Yes, Connor.
Okay, so when you talk about praying Mass, is it a verbal prayer or is it a mental prayer? Like, should you be trying to meditate during Mass, or should you be saying, okay, I need to be like sticking to like
Yeah, so you need to be following along, which means doesn't mean like you have to verbatim pray the prayers, right? So like again in Latin Mass that'd be really hard, right? Because a lot of times it's hard to tell exactly where he is. But the idea is that okay, so I know at this point he's offering it for the church, and maybe that's where my mental prayer goes. But you want to follow what's going on the altar in that way.
you need to, okay, so he's praying for the church now, but now he's praying for the dead. You know, I need to be like following that closely, or can it be like just kind of generally?
Yeah, I think more generally in that regard, like certain things that are obvious, right? Like the penitential rite, like you ought to be praying that along with the priest. But then some of the other the more and this is where the Eucharistic prayer and the Novus Ordo is so fast that it's a little difficult to do that. So normally I will pick up on one and I'll make that my prayer, like one aspect of the Eucharistic prayer, and I'll pray through that.
And then with the readings in the homily, should you be like, again, maybe should you be paying attention to that, or you say, okay, first reading I found something I want to like pray on, I just got to pray through that through the homily.
Yeah, so the purpose of the homily, right, ought to be to stimulate your prayer. And so if it leads you into something, like normally, I think I talked about this before, that, I mean, some priests just give like kind of dull homilies, right? Like just you know, yeah. So normally, if I can pick up one theme from them that I can pray about, especially if I know the priest and homily is not his thing, I will pick up one theme and I will pray about it during his homily. There's nothing, again, your attention is on God and the sacrifice, not necessarily on the priest's words or even what, the exact place where the priest is in the mass, right?
Yeah, I'm more sick, sometimes either the homily like isn't the best, having out there or something. Sometimes it's hard to understand them, and sometimes or sometimes you're like, okay, that second reading really was impactful, and I want to sit with this longer.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's perfectly fine. Try to avoid like tuning people out though, right? Like that's the only thing I would try to avoid. Yes, Ryan.